Bullies had no idea they just attacked the president's son. What if the quietest student at school was hiding the biggest secret of all? A student no one ever questioned. A student who never stood out, never made a scene, and never gave anyone a reason to look closer. He was always there, sitting at the back of the classroom, walking alone in the halls, blending into the background, like he was meant to be unnoticed. But what if there was more to him than anyone realized? What if the silence wasn't emptiness, but something hidden just beneath the surface? What if one day, that quiet student was forced into the spotlight, exposed in a way no one could have expected? And what if, in that moment, everything changed? This is exactly what happened at Belridge Academy, a school known for its prestige, its ambition, and its students, some of the brightest, most competitive minds in the country. In a place like this, power wasn't just about strength, it was about intelligence, confidence, and control. And those who held it didn't let go easily. But one student was different. He wasn't loud, he didn't demand attention, and yet, with nothing but his words, he turned the entire school on its head. One victory, one moment. That was all it took for the balance to shift. But not everyone was willing to accept it. And before the day was over, those who felt threatened would make a choice, one they would regret for the rest of their lives. Want to know what happens next? Stay tuned and make sure to subscribe for more thrilling stories like this. Hit the like button if you're enjoying the story so far, and don't forget to turn on notifications so you never miss an episode. Now, back to the story. Belridge Academy was the most prestigious school in the country. It was where the children of world leaders, CEOs, and powerful families studied. The halls were lined with marble floors, golden chandeliers, and towering bookshelves. Students weren't just expected to succeed, they were expected to be the best. Adrian Lancaster was different from the others. He never bragged about his family, he never tried to stand out. While other students formed groups and talked about their future careers, Adrian sat in the back of the classroom, quietly observing. He didn't push his way into conversations or try to impress anyone. He was the kind of student people barely noticed. Never the loudest, never the most social, never the one drawing attention. Some thought he was just shy. Others assumed he didn't have what it took to compete with the best. After all, at Belridge Academy, students prided themselves on being bold, outspoken, and confident. Those who stayed quiet were often overlooked, dismissed as unimportant. Most students barely acknowledged him. Some ignored him completely, acting as if he didn't exist. Others weren't so subtle. Adrian wasn't just overlooked, he was outcast. At a school where power meant everything, silence was seen as weakness, and weakness had consequences. Some students whispered about him when he walked by, mocking the way he always sat alone. Others took it further, knocking his books to the floor, taking his seat in the cafeteria just to force him to move, throwing insults when teachers weren't around. He never fought back, never reacted, never gave them the satisfaction of seeing him break. But that only made them push harder. To them, he was nothing, someone who didn't belong, someone who didn't matter. That was their mistake, because in just one debate, Adrian was about to prove them all wrong. But when he stepped onto the debate stage, everything changed. Most students didn't even know Adrian was part of the debate team. He wasn't the type to boast about it, and he certainly wasn't the kind of competitor people feared. At Belridge Academy, debate wasn't just a club. It was a battlefield where only the sharpest minds thrived. The best debaters had reputations. They were known for their confidence, their ability to think on their feet, and their powerful way with words. Adrian, he was known for none of those things. In fact, most students found it funny to imagine him in a debate at all. The quiet kid? The one who barely spoke in class? The one who never fought back when others pushed him around? It didn't seem possible. Some even thought it was a mistake. "I didn't even know he was on the team," someone whispered, barely hiding their amusement. "You sure this isn't a joke?" another snickered. "Guess they needed an extra body to fill a seat," one of the students from the rival team muttered under his breath. Even some of his own classmates shook their heads. To them, Adrian wasn't a real contender. He was just someone standing in the wrong place at the wrong time. the kind of person who would stumble over his words, crack under pressure, and embarrass himself the moment he opened his mouth. Because that was who Adrian Lancaster was. He wasn't a leader. He wasn't someone people paid attention to. He was the student who sat at the back of the class, never raising his hand, never drawing attention. The one who walked through the halls unnoticed, always keeping his head down, always fading into the background. To most students, Adrian was forgettable at best. At worst, he was the target of passing jokes, someone to nudge and whisper about, someone who didn't fight back when people talked over him or dismissed him entirely. So when his name was called as one of the debate participants, no one took it seriously. A few students laughed outright. Others simply exchanged puzzled looks. Adrian? The same Adrian who barely spoke during class discussions? The one no one had ever heard raise his voice? The idea of him standing on stage, holding his own in front of the entire school, was absurd. And yet, there he was, stepping forward. A low murmur spread through the audience as students leaned forward, suddenly more interested, not because they expected to be impressed, but because they were waiting for the inevitable disaster. This wasn't going to be a debate. This was going to be a humiliation. But they were wrong. Because the moment Adrian took his place at the podium, something shifted. The quiet, overlooked student they thought they knew wasn't the one standing before them now. The Belridge Debate Championship was the biggest event of the year. Only the best students competed, and the entire school gathered to watch. It wasn't just about winning. It was about proving who was the smartest, the most persuasive, and the most powerful. And Adrian Lancaster was up against the worst kind of opponents. Liam Carter, Ethan Marshall, and Noah Hayes. They weren't just the top debaters. They were the ones who ruled the school. Charismatic, well-spoken, and always in control, they walked through Belridge Academy like they owned it. Teachers praised them, students admired them, and they knew it. But their confidence wasn't just built on talent, it was built on dominance. Liam, Ethan, and Noah had a reputation, one that went beyond debating. They didn't just defeat their opponents, they humiliated them. If someone was weaker, they made sure they felt it. If someone didn't fit into their world, they made sure they knew it. And Adrian? He was their favorite target. They saw his silence as weakness. His solitude was something to be mocked. Adrian never provoked them, never gave them a reason to go after him, but they did anyway, because they could. Liam would shove past him in the halls, acting like Adrian wasn't even there. Ethan would casually knock over Adrian's books, watching with amusement as he had to pick them up. Noah made sure there was never a seat for him at lunch, making it clear he wasn't welcome. And worst of all, they never got in trouble for it. To them, Adrian wasn't worth respecting. He was just the quiet kid, the one no one stood up for, the one they could push around without consequences. So when they saw his name on the debate list, they didn't take him seriously. To them, this wasn't a competition. It was an opportunity. A chance to embarrass him in front of the entire school. A chance to prove, once and for all, that Adrian Lancaster didn't belong. And they were sure they were going to win. The debate began. Liam spoke with force, Ethan spoke with speed, and Noah spoke with sharp comebacks. They attacked Adrian's arguments again and again, but he stayed calm. His words were clear, his logic was solid. He countered every point without hesitation. Liam Carter, Ethan Marshall, and Noah Hayes were some of the most confident students at Belridge Academy. They were used to winning, used to being admired. They spoke with authority, walked with confidence, and never backed down from a challenge. Losing wasn't something they experienced often. The Belridge Academy Debate Championship was no ordinary school event. It was held in the Grand Auditorium, a place reserved for the most important ceremonies. Towering columns framed the stage, and the school's emblem, a golden crest symbolizing excellence, hung above the podium. The judges weren't just teachers. They were renowned scholars, professionals, and even former debate champions. The audience was filled with students, parents, and faculty, all eager to see which team would claim victory. The final debate topic had been a difficult one. It required logic, deep analysis, and the ability to counter opposing arguments with precision. Liam, Ethan, and Noah had walked in confident, believing their charisma and quick thinking would secure an easy win. But today they lost. When the debate ended, the judges made their decision. Adrian had won. The audience clapped, and some students cheered, but in the crowd, Liam, Ethan, and Noah sat frozen, their hands curled into fists. They had lost, and they weren't going to let it go. As Adrian stepped off the stage, they exchanged a look. They weren't done with him yet. They were going to teach him a lesson, but they had no idea who he really was. Adrian Lancaster had defeated them in front of the entire school. He hadn't raised his voice or relied on flashy words. His arguments had been clear, precise, and impossible to tear down. Every time they tried to outmaneuver him, he calmly redirected the discussion, leaving them scrambling for a response. By the final round, they weren't debating anymore. They were just trying to keep up. And then it was over. The same student they had mocked, the same student they had ignored, underestimated, and looked down on. That was the one who had just outmatched the best debaters in the school. The auditorium was silent for a moment, stunned. Then, a wave of whispers spread through the crowd. Students who had barely even noticed Adrian before were now staring at him in disbelief. Some exchanged glances, as if trying to understand how the quietest student in school had just taken down 3 of the most confident competitors. Even the judges, experienced and sharp-eyed, nodded in quiet approval. Liam, Ethan, and Noah stood frozen, their confidence shattered. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. They had expected an easy win. Instead, they had been outclassed by the very person they thought didn't belong. Adrian hadn't mocked them, hadn't even looked proud of his victory. He had simply nodded, collected his notes, and walked off the stage as if the outcome had never been in doubt. That made it worse. It wasn't just that they had lost. It was that Adrian had beaten them so effortlessly, it felt like he hadn't even considered them a real challenge. Liam clenched his jaw as he stood near the exit of the debate hall. Ethan cracked his knuckles. Noah crossed his arms, his expression unreadable. They weren't going to let this go. Adrian had embarrassed them, in front of the entire school, in front of their teachers, their classmates, everyone who had ever looked up to them. And the worst part? He hadn't boasted. He hadn't even looked proud. That made it sting even more. It was like he had walked away because they weren't worth his time. Liam's fists tightened. They had spent years building their reputation, proving they were the best. Then Adrian, the quiet kid, had come out of nowhere and destroyed everything in a single debate. Ethan exhaled sharply. They had mocked him, pushed him around, made sure he knew his place. But now, people were whispering about Adrian instead of them. Noah's stare darkened. They weren't just going to let that happen. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Adrian Lancaster had humiliated them, and now they were going to make sure he never did it again. They didn't care if he was smart. They didn't care if he had just defeated them with words, because words wouldn't save him now. They were going to make him pay. What they didn't know was that the moment they decided to go after Adrian Lancaster was the moment they sealed their own fate. And by the time this was over, they would regret it for the rest of their lives. The crowd had long since left. The hallways were quiet now, empty except for the soft echoes of distant footsteps. Then a familiar figure appeared. Adrian had just finished packing his bag and was heading toward the main exit. He walked calmly, adjusting the strap on his shoulder, unaware of what was coming. Liam, Ethan, and Noah stepped forward. Adrian barely had time to react before Liam shoved him hard against the wall. His back hit the cold surface, and his books tumbled to the floor. A few papers slipped out, drifting across the polished tiles. Adrian didn't say a word. He simply looked up at them, his face unreadable. Because this wasn't new. The shoving, the taunts, the humiliation, it had happened too many times before. At this point, he had lost track of how many times he had been backed into a corner, how many times his things had been knocked from his hands, how many times he had heard the same cruel laughter echoing down the halls. And yet, he never fought back. Not because he was weak, not because he was afraid, but because there was no point. No one would believe him. No one would stand up for him. He was just Adrian Lancaster, the quiet kid, the easy target, the student who never made a scene. The teachers turned a blind eye, and the students who weren't involved pretended not to notice. So he had learned to endure it, to pick up his books without a word, to walk away as if it didn't bother him, to act like their words and their actions didn't leave invisible bruises beneath the surface. And right now, as he stared up at Liam, Ethan, and Noah, who towered over him with the same smug confidence they always carried, he knew exactly how this would go. They would push him, mock him, take what little dignity he had left, and walk away laughing. Because that was how it always happened. But what they didn't know, what no one knew, was that today, everything was about to change. Liam smirked. "What's the matter? You talk big in debates, but now you've got nothing to say?" Ethan nudged one of Adrian's books with his foot. "All those fancy words, but let's see how smart you are now." Noah glanced around the hallway. It was empty, silent. His lips curled into a smirk. No security, no cameras, just us. Adrian sighed and adjusted his glasses. He didn't look afraid. He didn't even look angry. He just looked disappointed, because he had already decided. This was the last time. The last time he would be shoved into a wall. The last time his things would be knocked from his hands. The last time he would let them believe he was weak, let them believe they had power over him. For years he had endured their cruelty, every shove, every insult, every time they laughed at his silence, mistaking it for fear. He had let it happen, let them believe they controlled him, let them believe he was nothing. But today that illusion would shatter. They thought they had him cornered. They thought they had finally broken him. They had no idea. Adrian Lancaster had never been powerless. He had simply been waiting. And now they were about to learn a lesson, one they would never forget. Liam's smirk faltered for a second. Then, at the far end of the hall, a figure moved. A tall man in a black suit stood just beyond the shadows. His stance was firm, his gaze locked on the scene unfolding before him. He wasn't just watching, he was waiting. Liam, Ethan, and Noah didn't notice him. Not yet. Liam tightened his grip, his fingers curling into a fist. The silence in the hallway felt heavy. He could feel Adrian's calm stare, that same quiet confidence that had humiliated them in the debate. It made his blood boil. He wanted to wipe that look off Adrian's face. He pulled back his hand, ready to shove him again. Bang. A door at the end of the hallway flew open, slamming against the wall. The sharp sound echoed through the empty corridor. Before Liam could even turn his head, they appeared. Dark suits, steady movements, eyes locked like trained hunters. They were Secret Service agents. Black-clad agents poured into the hallway, their formation perfect, their expressions unreadable. Every step they took was controlled, every motion sharp. The air shifted, charged with something cold and dangerous. These weren't just school security guards. These were the elite, the men and women trained to protect the most powerful figures in the country. And right now their focus was on Adrian Lancaster. "Step away, now." The voice was firm, commanding. It wasn't a threat, it was an order. Liam's breath caught in his throat. His arm remained frozen in midair, still raised from where he had been about to strike. His mind struggled to catch up with what was happening. Ethan took a step back, his confidence shattering. What's going on?" Noah's instinct screamed at him to run. He spun on his heel, but before he could take a single step, an agent blocked his path. The man didn't move aggressively. He didn't need to. The sheer presence of him, the way he stood with perfect control, was enough. Liam's throat went dry. His heart pounded in his ears. We were just messing around," he stammered. The lead agent didn't blink. His face remained blank, unreadable. "On the ground, hands where we can see them." No one argued. Ethan dropped to his knees first. Noah followed. Liam's legs shook as he lowered himself, his mind racing. This wasn't normal. This wasn't how fights at school ended. This was something else. For the first time, the bullies weren't in control. The power they had used to intimidate others was gone. No snide remarks, no shoves in the hallway, no cruel laughter. This time, there was no escape. Liam's breath came in short gasps. He had always believed that strength meant control, that as long as he and his friends were feared, no one could touch them. But now, with armed agents surrounding them, their strength meant nothing. They had been caught. All the times they had pushed Adrian around, all the moments they had made his life miserable, it had never crossed their minds that one day they'd pay for it. They thought they could shove him, humiliate him, remind him of his place. But now, their own place had been decided for them, and it wasn't in control. It was on their knees. Adrian stood quietly, watching. His expression hadn't changed. He wasn't surprised, he wasn't scared, he was just waiting. The hallway was silent except for the agent's footsteps. The air was thick with tension, but Adrian remained still, his gaze steady. The way he stood, calm, composed, felt wrong. Someone surrounded by armed agents should be panicking, should be demanding answers. But Adrian, he just sighed and shook his head. "I told you," he murmured, his voice steady, almost tired. "You don't know who I am." Liam's breath caught in his throat. He still didn't understand. None of this made sense. Just minutes ago, Adrian had been the same quiet kid they had always pushed around, the one who never fought back, never raised his voice, never even looked at them with anger. But now, he was different. He stood there, calm and unwavering, as if he had always known this moment would come. There was no fear in his eyes, no hesitation in his voice. It was as if he had shed the quiet, overlooked student they thought they knew, and become someone entirely different, someone they didn't recognize. And then there were the men in black suits. They moved with precision, their presence sharp and commanding. They weren't teachers, they weren't school security, they were something else, something bigger. And somehow, they were here for Adrian. Liam's mind raced, trying to piece it together. Why were they listening to him? Why did they speak to him with such respect? Who were these people? And more importantly, who exactly was Adrian Lancaster? Before he could process Adrian's words, one of the agents turned, not toward Liam, not toward Ethan or Noah, but toward Adrian himself. And then, for the first time, the agent's expression changed. It wasn't cold, it wasn't threatening, it was respectful. "Mr. Lancaster, are you all right?" The words rang in Liam's ears. "Mr. Lancaster?" The name sent a jolt through him. It sounded familiar, too familiar. It was a name he had heard on the news, a name attached to the most powerful family in the country. His mind raced, pieces snapping together like a puzzle. Adrian Lancaster. His stomach dropped. He wasn't just some quiet, bookish kid. He was the president's son. Liam's throat went dry. His vision blurred for a second as a wave of memories crashed into him all at once. The times they had cornered him in the hall, shoving his books to the floor just to watch him kneel and pick them up. The times they had whispered insults as they passed him in class, laughing when he didn't react, thinking he was too weak to fight back. The times they had made sure he never had a place to sit at lunch, forcing him to eat alone at the farthest table in the cafeteria. The countless moments they had spent making his life miserable, because they could, because they thought he was beneath them. And now, standing frozen in the hallway, Liam realized the truth. They hadn't been tormenting some quiet nobody. They had been picking a fight with the most protected person in the school. No, the most protected person in the entire country. Liam's legs felt weak. His stomach churned. This wasn't just a mistake. It was the worst mistake of their lives. Hands where we can see them. The command was sharp, leaving no room for argument. Ethan took a step back, but an agent blocked his path. Noah's mouth opened like he wanted to protest, but no words came out. Liam, usually so quick with a sneer or a comeback, could only stare as cold, professional hands grabbed his arm. The next moments were a blur, being escorted through the halls, students staring in shock, teachers too stunned to interfere. The weight of their actions pressed down with every step. No one explained where they were going. No one had to. They were in real trouble. Before they knew it, they were outside. A black SUV was waiting at the curb, its dark windows reflecting the stunned faces of students who had gathered to watch. The agents guided them inside, shutting the doors behind them. The car pulled away. The car ride felt endless. Liam, Ethan, and Noah sat stiffly, their hands gripping their knees. The black SUV moved smoothly through the streets, but their hearts pounded with every passing mile. They weren't being taken to the principal's office. They weren't even being taken home. They were going somewhere much worse. When the vehicle finally stopped, the doors unlocked with a quiet click. No one spoke as the agent stepped out first, waiting. The boys hesitated, exchanging nervous glances, but they had no choice. They followed. The moment their feet touched the pavement, reality hit them. They weren't at school anymore. They weren't anywhere familiar. They were standing in front of the White House. The most secure building in the world loomed before them, its massive columns and towering presence making them feel small. Armed guards stood at every corner, their expressions cold and unreadable. Cameras tracked their every move. The air itself felt heavier, filled with an unspoken authority that pressed down on them. A silent order was given. The agents led them inside. The marble floors gleamed beneath their feet. The hallways stretched long and endless, filled with people in dark suits and earpieces, each one carrying a sense of purpose. Every step the boys took echoed against the walls. No one spoke to them. No one even spared them a glance. Until he arrived. At the end of the hallway, a set of grand doors swung open. And there he stood, the President of the United States. The weight of his presence filled the room, a silent reminder of the power he held, not just as a leader, but as a father. His sharp eyes took in the scene, unreadable yet commanding, the kind of gaze that made people straighten their backs and hold their breath. For years, everyone had known the name Lancaster. It was a name that carried history, influence, and an unshakable legacy. The world had watched as Adrian's father rose through the ranks, from a respected senator to the most powerful man in the country. His leadership was decisive, his words carried weight, and his actions shaped the nation. But through it all, Adrian had remained unseen. Unlike other children of powerful figures, he had never flaunted his name. He never sought privilege or special treatment. There were no security escorts trailing him through the hallways, no whispered rumors about favors or influence. He was just Adrian De Lorenzo, the quiet, bookish student no one ever paid attention to, because that was how he wanted it. He never used his last name to shield himself. He never once spoke his father's title in defense. And in return, his father had allowed him to live as normally as possible, to build his own identity without the shadow of power hanging over him. But now, there was no hiding. Now, the truth stood in the doorway, undeniable and absolute. The President of the United States had arrived, and Liam, Ethan, and Noah finally understood who they had been up against all along. Liam swallowed hard. Ethan stiffened. Noah's breath hitched. This was the most powerful man in the country, and he was looking directly at them. The doors shut behind them. The silence was deafening. Then the president took a step forward, his sharp gaze locking onto each of them. "You put your hands on my son." President Alexander Lancaster was a man of control. In public, he was known for his composure, his carefully measured words, his ability to command a room without ever raising his voice. He was respected across the world, not just for his power but for the way he wielded it. A leader who never acted on impulse, who valued diplomacy over aggression. But here, behind closed doors, there was no podium, no cameras, no political restraint. This wasn't the President of the United States speaking. This was a father whose son had been tormented, humiliated, and hurt by the boys standing before him. His voice didn't rise. It didn't need to. Every syllable carried a weight that made the air feel heavier. He had spent his career negotiating with world leaders, standing firm against threats far greater than schoolyard bullies. But nothing tested his restraint more than this moment, because as much as he believed in diplomacy, in control, this was his son. And no one touched his son without consequences. Liam's stomach twisted. His hands felt clammy, his breath uneven. His mind raced through every possibility. Expulsion, legal action, something worse. Was this it? Was this the moment his entire future was taken away? He thought about his parents, about what they would say when they found out, about how his name, his family's name, would be dragged through the headlines. For the first time, the weight of his actions truly sank in. Ethan clenched his fists, trying to keep his breathing steady. His mind raced through every possibility. Expulsion, legal action, something worse. Was this it? Was this the moment his entire future was taken away? Noah wished he could disappear. His legs felt like they were sinking into the floor. This wasn't just facing an angry principal or a disappointed teacher. This was the President of the United States, a man with power beyond anything they could imagine. What was going to happen to them? Would they be expelled, arrested, their families shamed? Did they even have a future after this? Liam felt cold sweat trickle down his back. He had always thought he was untouchable. But standing here, under the weight of the president's gaze, he realized something terrifying. They had picked the wrong person to mess with. And now they were about to face the consequences. The president's voice was calm, but it carried weight. Every word hit like a hammer. I could have you expelled. I could have you arrested. His gaze never wavered. But I won't. Not yet. The tension was unbearable. No one dared to breathe. There was no hesitation in his tone, only certainty. A man who had spent years balancing justice with diplomacy, who knew the power of consequences, but also the importance of measured action. As a father, his instincts screamed for justice, for punishment. These boys had tormented his son, humiliated him, laid their hands on him as if he were nothing. Every ounce of him wanted to make them understand what it meant to cross a Lancaster. But as president, he understood the weight of his position. He couldn't let personal vengeance dictate his actions. He had to be fair, even to those who didn't deserve it. His hands remained at his sides, his expression unreadable. He wasn't just addressing 3 scared students. He was making a statement, a lesson. Because power wasn't about taking revenge, it was about control. And right now, his control was the only thing standing between them and the consequences they had no idea they were inches from facing. Then, just for a moment, his voice softened. But instead, you're going to learn something today. About respect, about consequences. He turned his head slightly. What do you think, son? For the first time since they arrived, Adrian stepped forward. The weight of the moment settled on his shoulders. He could feel the tension in the room, the silent expectation. His father's authority filled the space, but now, all eyes were on him. This was it. Adrian had spent years keeping his head down, choosing silence over confrontation, blending into the background when he had every reason to stand in the spotlight. He wasn't oblivious to the power that came with his last name. He knew exactly who he was. The president's son. A Lancaster. Someone who, with a single word, could turn the lives of these boys upside down. But that was exactly why he had chosen to live differently. He never wanted special treatment. He never wanted fear or privilege to shape the way people treated him. He wanted to be judged for who he was, not the influence he carried. So he had let himself be the underdog. He had let the world see him as small, weak, insignificant. Because in doing so, he learned who people truly were. Liam, Ethan, and Noah had never seen him as a threat. They had mocked him, humiliated him, torn him down for nothing more than existing. And now, standing before them, he had the power to do the same. But Adrian knew something they didn't. True strength wasn't about revenge. It was about control. He took a slow breath, steadying himself. This decision wasn't just about them. It was about who he chose to be. And Adrian Lancaster would not become like them. He wasn't nervous. He wasn't afraid. He met his father's gaze with the same quiet confidence he had always carried. He had all the power now. Liam's mouth felt dry. Adrian could demand anything: punishment, revenge. And that was the thought that terrified them the most. They had escaped the wrath of the president, but what about Adrian? He was the one they had tormented for months, the one they shoved, insulted, humiliated. They had made his life miserable simply because they could. And now, after all of it, he was the one standing in front of them, holding their fate in his hands. Adrian's mind raced, but not with anger, not with hatred. He thought about every insult, every shove in the hallway, every moment they had tried to tear him down just because he was different. He remembered the times they made him feel small, like he didn't belong, like he was nothing. He had every reason to make them suffer, every reason to make them feel what he had felt. And yet, that wasn't who he was. Adrian let out a quiet breath. Liam, Ethan, and Noah were waiting for a sentence, for him to take his revenge. But revenge wouldn't fix anything. It wouldn't make them understand. Adrian didn't want to ruin them. He wanted to change them. Instead, he sighed. "I think they should spend a day here. See what real power looks like. Maybe then they'll understand." The president studied his son for a moment. Then, he gave a small nod. "So be it." At that moment, the agents stepped forward. The bullies didn't fight. They didn't argue. They simply followed. Not to a prison cell, not to detention, but to a lesson they would never forget. Liam, Ethan, and Noah had expected the worst. They had braced themselves for punishment, for humiliation, for something that would haunt them forever. But as the agents led them deeper into the White House, something strange happened. No one yelled at them. No one threw them into a cold room or forced them to apologize. Instead, they were brought somewhere unexpected. A quiet conference room. The walls were lined with bookshelves, filled with documents and history. A large window overlooked the city where the world's most powerful leaders had stood before them. And in the center of the room sat Adrian Lancaster. But he wasn't the Adrian they knew from school. Gone was the quiet, overlooked student who kept his head down. Here, in this room, he wasn't the outcast, the bookish kid they had mocked. He sat with an air of quiet authority, his posture relaxed but confident. He didn't need to prove himself. He already belonged here. He wasn't flanked by security. He wasn't sitting behind some massive desk, ready to judge them. He was just there, waiting. The agents stepped aside, giving them space. For the first time since the debate, it was just them. Adrian leaned back slightly, studying them. There was no gloating in his eyes, no trace of revenge. He wasn't looking at them like enemies. He wasn't looking at them like victims either. He was looking at them like someone who knew he had the power to ruin them and chose not to. "I could have let my father ruin your lives," he said simply. "I could have had you expelled. Make sure you never set foot in Belridge again." Liam shifted uncomfortably. Ethan looked down. Noah clenched his jaw, waiting for the blow. But that's not power. Adrian's voice was calm, thoughtful. Power isn't about hurting people just because you can. It's not about proving you're stronger or making people fear you. He gestured to the room around them. Real power is about responsibility, about understanding the weight of your choices. He leaned forward. "You think you're tough because you pushed me into a wall." His voice wasn't mocking, just disappointed. "Do you know what my father does every day? He makes decisions that affect millions of people. One wrong move and entire lives could be changed forever." Liam swallowed hard. He had never thought about it that way. Adrian exhaled, looking out the window. "I didn't ask for this life. I didn't ask to be watched every second of the day. I didn't ask to have security follow me wherever I go. But I accept it because I have to, because that's what leadership is." He turned back to them, his eyes steady. "I don't want an apology. I don't even need you to like me. But I hope you leave here understanding what you did. It wasn't strength. It was a weakness. The words hit harder than any punishment ever could. Adrian could have done the same to them. He could have humiliated them the way they humiliated him. He could have used his power, his influence, to make sure they suffered the way they had made him suffer. He could have watched as they crumbled under the weight of consequences far greater than a schoolyard scuffle. But he didn't, and that was what made it worse. For the first time, Liam, Ethan, and Noah truly saw Adrian. Not just as the quiet kid from their school, not just as the president's son, but as someone better than them. And it wasn't because of his father. It was because he chose kindness, even when they didn't deserve it. Liam's mind replayed every cruel remark, every shove in the hallways, every time they had mocked Adrian for being different, the time they had spilled water on his books just to watch him scramble to pick them up, the time they had locked him in a classroom after school, laughing as he banged on the door, the time they had pushed him into the mud after a rainy day, just because they could. Adrian had every reason to hate them, but instead of choosing revenge, he had chosen something else, something they never would have, and that made them realize they were the weak ones. The door opened behind them. An agent stepped in. "The car is ready, sir." Adrian stood, adjusting his glasses. "You can go back to your lives now, but if you really want to be powerful, start by being better." The three boys didn't argue, didn't make excuses. They simply nodded, then turned and walked out. But this time, they weren't walking with the same arrogance they once had. Their steps were slower, heavier, weighed down by everything they had done. The realization of their actions clung to them like a shadow, impossible to ignore. Liam's mind replayed every cruel word he had thrown at Adrian, every shove, every smirk. He had spent so much time trying to tear Adrian down, but in the end, Adrian had been the better person. Ethan clenched his fists, but not in anger, in shame. The feeling burned in his chest. He had been so sure of himself, so sure that Adrian was weak. But Adrian was stronger than any of them, not because of power, but because he had chosen kindness over revenge. Noah kept his head down. The truth was painful, but undeniable. They had been bullies, plain and simple. And now, standing in the presence of someone they had wronged, someone who had the power to destroy them, but instead chose to teach them, it made them realize just how small they had been. They weren't just leaving a room. They were leaving behind who they used to be. And for the first time, they were ready to change. The lesson had been taught, and they would never forget it. Because today, he had learned a lesson he would never forget. Never underestimate the quiet ones, especially when their last name is Lancaster. So remember this, kids. The next time you look at someone and think they don't matter, the next time you assume someone is weak just because they don't fight back, take a step back and think. Because the world isn't always what it seems. The quiet ones, the ones who sit in the back of the room, the ones who don't shove their way to the front, the ones who don't need to prove themselves with words alone, they are the ones you should never underestimate. Real strength doesn't come from arrogance. It doesn't come from loud voices or from pushing others down just to feel bigger. Real strength is knowing you could destroy someone, but choosing not to. Real strength is patience, resilience, and knowing that when the time comes, actions will always speak louder than words. And sometimes, the ones you think are invisible, the ones you laugh at, push around, and ignore, they are the ones who are watching, learning, waiting. Because when the moment comes, when the truth is revealed, you might just realize that the person you thought was nothing was someone greater than you could have ever imagined. So choose wisely, because the people you belittle today might be the ones who decide your fate tomorrow. Did you enjoy this story? Want more thrilling tales filled with unexpected twists and powerful lessons? Then, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to our channel. We bring you the most exciting stories that keep you on the edge of your seat, full of action, drama, and unforgettable moments. Hit that notification bell so you never miss a new episode. And remember, sometimes the quietest people have the most powerful stories. Subscribe now and we'll see you in the next one.